They walked in silence, mothers clutching infants wrapped in scraps of cloth. Elderly men hobbled through snow with bare feet, while children with hollow eyes dragged behind wagons that held everything their families owned, or rather everything they could carry when they were told to leave at gunpoint. This is not ancient history, it's not myth nor metaphor. This is America in 1838. It's the Trail of Tears. For generations, the Cherokee Nation had negotiated, assimilated, and hoped. They had adopted a written constitution modeled on America's own. Many practiced Christianity. They ran newspaper schools and farms, some with enslaved labor, just like their white neighbors. They played the game of civilization by the rules the U.S. government had told them they had to follow. But rules don't matter when land is involved. By the late 1830s, the Cherokee Nation had become an obstacle, not to security, not to peace, but to cotton. Their crime? Occupying millions of acres in the southeastern United States that white settlers now wanted, desperately. And President Andrew Jackson, a man who had built a political career on defying elite institutions and flexing executive muscle, had made it clear the courts would not stop removal. The treaties would not protect native sovereignty. And the suffering that followed? It was, in his view, a necessary cost of progress. In the wake of the Indian Removal Act, some tribes had already been forced west. But the Cherokee resisted, legally, peacefully, all the way to the Supreme Court. When they won in Worcester v. Georgia, Jackson ignored the ruling. And with Jackson's successor, Martin Van Buren, now in office, along with the machinery that Jackson's policy was still running, the final removal began. It didn't matter that winter was coming. It didn't matter that there weren't enough wagons, blankets, food, or medicine. It didn't matter that entire communities were being uprooted with no preparation under military guard. What followed was not a relocation. It was a forced march of over 1,000 miles, in some cases through ice and snow, in others through sweltering heat and drought. It was a death sentence wrapped in legal language and sealed by indifference. Estimates vary, but roughly 1 in 4 Cherokees died on that journey west. That's 4,000 lives lost, many of them children, elders, the infirm. The graves that they were buried in were shallow. The tears were real. The U.S. government had no plan for resettlement, no plan for sanitation, no plan for food supplies. The military command charged with execution was overwhelmed, under-resourced, and mostly apathetic. Private John Burnett bore witness to the forced march of the damned, telling those that would listen that the sufferings of the Cherokees were awful. The trail was marked by the graves of their dead. This wasn't some back-office failure of logistics. This was a predictable outcome of federal policy designed without care, executed without mercy. Jackson may have framed removal as protective, a path to peace, but he never ensured that the path was survivable. And the nation didn't look away, it watched. Missionaries, U.S. soldiers, and foreign observers like Alexis de Tocqueville documented the suffering with grim detail. Families which had lived in the Southeast for generations, some whose ancestors had called this land home for thousands of years, were now herded like prisoners across mountains and rivers towards an unknown fate. Some still hoped, others prayed, most simply endured. This was not an accident of history, it was policy, and it came not just from the frontier, but from the highest office in the land, with Andrew Jackson's signature on the blueprint. The Trail of Tears is not a footnote. It's not a tragic byproduct of expansion. It was the result of choices, deliberate, callous, and for thousands, fatal. Today, we walk you through what happened after the votes were counted, after the ink dried, when rhetoric gave way to reality and native families paid the price for a nation's greed. You're listening to Empires, Anarchy, and Other Notable Moments, a podcast designed for deep dives that assist in the teaching of history. This series focuses upon America's 7th president, Andrew Jackson. Episode number 7, The Fight to the Finish. Having secured passage of the Indian Removal Act, Jackson believed he had done a public good, clearing the land of what he insisted was a security threat, and opening vast territory for white settlement, particularly for the expanding southern plantation economy. In his mind, he wasn't displacing a people, he was fulfilling a civilizing mission. What good man, he asked, would prefer a country covered with forests and ranged by a few thousand savages? If Indian removal reflected Jackson's vision for America's physical future, land, labor, and agricultural expansion, then his next battle targeted the nation's financial future. His war on the Bank of the United States wasn't driven by lofty ideals. It was born from deep-seated distrust. Jackson believed the bank was an engine of corruption, a tool for powerful political insiders to entrench themselves and rig the system against ordinary citizens. In both fights, Jackson cast himself as a guardian of the common man, using federal power not to preserve institutions, but to tear down the ones he believed served the elite at the expense of everyone else. That put him on a collision course with the bank's president, Nicholas Biddle, who was, by all accounts, a genius. The valedictorian of his Princeton class, Biddle knew he was brilliant. But like many hyper-intelligent people raised in privilege, he badly underestimated men whose intelligence came from the frontier instead of the academy. As accomplished as Jackson was, Biddle was the sort of man who would have smirked at the president's honorary Harvard degree. While most Americans never left their country, Biddle spent years roaming Europe, studying the classics in England, France, Italy, and Greece. Biddle became the nation's first and last central banker for the Second Bank of the United States. Phil Davies of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis notes that Biddle was a master of his craft. Under his firm direction, the Second Bank grew into a powerful instrument of monetary stability, the rock upon which a decade of robust economic growth was built. But Davies also highlights the fatal weaknesses. Arrogant, hypersensitive to criticism, and unschooled in politics, he failed when put to the test during the vitriolic battle between Biddle and President Andrew Jackson over the rechartering of the bank. During the 1828 election, the bank's leadership made a catastrophic error. They appeared partisan. Under Biddle's watch, the institution directed disproportionate financial support towards allies of John Quincy Adams. The evidence was circumstantial, but the optics were disastrous. Rumors swirled that Henry Clay, already notorious for brokering the corrupt bargain, was pulling strings behind the scenes. Worse, Clay was expected to challenge Jackson again in 1832, making the bank look less like a neutral institution and more like the campaign arm of Jackson's enemies. As the 1832 election approached, Jackson viewed a second term not just as political survival, but as a mandate to secure his legacy. The Indian Removal Act had passed, but its most infamous consequences, the Trail of Tears, would unfold beneath his successor. The Nullification Crisis in South Carolina simmered dangerously. A defeat at the polls would embolden secessionists. Against this tense backdrop, Jackson saw the bank as an existential threat, an anti-democratic monster bent on controlling the republic. The bank, he warned, is trying to kill me, but I will kill it. To Jackson, rechartering the bank meant cementing the power of moneyed elites for a generation. He believed this was his moment to stop it. The bank wasn't just a financial institution, it was corruption incarnate. His skepticism of banks ran deep. Early in his career, Jackson had been burned in a land deal when he accepted paper money that would later become worthless. The humiliation stuck with him. For the rest of his life, he trusted gold and silver, hard money, and remained deeply suspicious of paper currency and credit, the very lifeblood of Biddle's banking system. But unlike the rest of the federal bureaucracy, which Jackson had already reshaped through the spoils system, the head of the bank was beyond even his reach. Under the bank's charter, neither Congress nor the president could remove Nicholas Biddle. Adding insult to injury, the government only appointed 5 of the bank's 25 directors. This insulation from politics gave Biddle a dangerous sense of invulnerability. As historian John Meacham puts it, Biddle's view of his own power was absolute. Presidents came and went, but the bank, Biddle believed, was eternal. To a degree, he wasn't wrong. The bank's charter wasn't set to expire until January 1836, in the middle of what would be Jackson's lame duck period, if he happened to win a second term. The safe move would have been to wait. Let Clay win in 1832. Let the bank continue along quietly. With a friendly administration in place, reauthorization was almost guaranteed. But safe wasn't bold enough. Clay and Biddle pushed for an early renewal, forcing the issue 4 years ahead of schedule. It was a trap. Force Jackson to veto the bill, then frame him as reckless and anti-business. Politically, they believed they had the president cornered. What they didn't anticipate was Jackson turning the fight into a crusade. For him, the bank wasn't a policy issue. It was the embodiment of elite corruption. And if the bank was the monster, then Jackson would be its slayer. It became the defining issue of the 1832 election. The president doubled down, framing the bank as a monopoly for the powerful, daring the nation to choose between entrenched privilege and democratic accountability. Henry Clay, Jackson's favorite rival, took the bait. He bet that Americans preferred financial stability over Jackson's populist fury. But Clay had misread the temperature of the country. Jackson's veto message, largely shaped by Van Buren, landed like a thunderclap. He declared, "It is to be regretted that the rich and powerful too often bend the axe of government to their selfish purposes." That single line electrified working-class voters. The veto wasn't just policy, it was a manifesto. When the votes were counted, Jackson didn't just win, he crushed Clay. In 1832, he secured 219 electoral votes to Clay's 49, an even more decisive victory than in 1828. It was a political knockout. Even in states where the bank held enormous influence, Jackson's message landed. As for Henry Clay, the defeat haunted him. Though he remained a powerful senator and ran for president again, the loss cemented his role not as Jackson's rival, but as his foil, a brilliant statesman repeatedly outmatched by Jackson's raw political instincts. The decision to veto the national bank was yet another move to expand the power of the executive at the expense of its co-equal branches. As Meacham explains, Jackson interpreted the court's ruling in McCulloch v. Maryland as inconclusive. His larger point was even more radical. A president should not simply defer to Congress or the judiciary. Instead, Jackson insisted, the president must take his own constitutional stand, speaking not for Washington insiders, but for the people at large. But Jackson's expanding notion of presidential power triggered an immediate backlash. Just 7 days after Jackson's re-election, South Carolina dropped a political bombshell. It formally nullified the Tariff of 1832. Suddenly, the Union faced a constitutional crisis on par with Shays' Rebellion or the War of 1812, and few believed Jackson was the man to handle it. The general had always been quick to reach for his sword. A heavy-handed response now could ignite a full-scale Southern rebellion. Jackson understood the stakes. Nullification wasn't just a policy dispute. It was a direct threat to the Union. If one state could choose which federal laws to obey, then the entire constitutional system could collapse. What the moment seemed to call for was calm diplomacy, a Henry Clay-style great compromiser. Instead, the nation had re-elected a warrior. Many voters quietly wondered whether they'd chosen the wrong man. Meacham writes that Jackson was embarking on perhaps the most delicate mission of his life: how to preserve the Union without appearing so tyrannical and power-hungry that other Southern states might join with South Carolina, precipitating an even graver crisis that could lead to the secession of several states. Rather than wade into a public duel with his estranged Vice President John C. Calhoun, Jackson took his case directly to the American people. In a bold, rhetorical pivot, he flipped South Carolina's argument on its head. Yes, he admitted, the tariff was unfair, but the remedy was not to tear down the Union. In a widely circulated proclamation, Jackson made a states' rights argument against nullification. With the national debt nearly paid off, a milestone he was quietly coordinating with Nicholas Biddle, the federal government could afford to reduce tariffs without undermining the rule of law. But Jackson didn't rely on persuasion alone. Behind the scenes, he ordered 6,000 federal arms quietly moved into strategic positions across South Carolina and pushed Congress to pass a force bill, giving him clear authority to use the military should the state attempt secession. This was no empty saber rattle. It was a calibrated show of federal resolve. And this time, Jackson wasn't defying the courts. He was invoking them. The laws of the United States must be executed, he declared. I have no discretionary power on the subject. My duty is emphatically pronounced in the Constitution. Disunion by armed force is treason. The irony was impossible to miss. Just a few years earlier, Jackson had shrugged off Chief Justice John Marshall's ruling in Worcester v. Georgia with a dismissive, let him enforce it. Now faced with nullification, Jackson wrapped himself in the Constitution and the rule of law. Observers saw the pivot immediately. Marshall, once a constitutional adversary, now fully backed the president. Insane as South Carolina unquestionably is, he wrote to a colleague, I do not think her so absolutely mad as to have made her declaration of war against the United States had she not counted on uniting the South, beginning with Virginia. But Virginia didn't join her, nor did Alabama, Mississippi, or Georgia. Each announced support for the president. Jackson, the populist warrior who had undermined judicial authority when it suited him, was suddenly its unlikely champion, so long as it served the preservation of the Union. To make any meaningful concessions on the tariff, Jackson needed buy-in from Northern senators. No small task. The tariff had long served as an economic shield for the industrial North, and Northern leaders like Representative John Quincy Adams were already uneasy about how much power Jackson was accumulating in the executive branch. As tensions rose, so did political realignment. Anti-Jackson forces, an eclectic mix of former national Republicans, disaffected Democrats, and states' rights Southerners, began to coalesce into what would become the Whig Party. The name was no accident. The British Whigs had resisted monarchical overreach, and Jackson's critics saw an ominous parallel. Before long, satirical prints of King Andrew I were everywhere. Jackson draped in royal robes, trampling the Constitution beneath his boots. On the Senate floor, Calhoun thundered that the proposed force bill would transform Jackson into a military dictator. But his argument didn't land. Jackson already had the constitutional authority to enforce federal law with troops. What he wanted was congressional backing, political cover to act decisively if South Carolina crossed the line. That moment nearly arrived on February 1st, 1833. The deadline South Carolina had set to begin ignoring the tariff entirely. The country held its breath. Would Jackson send in the army? Would the Union crack? Instead, Jackson waited, allowing his fiercest political rival to step into the spotlight. Henry Clay, the great compromiser, had been working behind the scenes for weeks on a diplomatic escape hatch. Clay wasn't just trying to save the Union, he was trying to contain the president. As Meacham put it, fix the tariff and foil nullification. Foil nullification and undercut the force bill. Undercut the force bill and check Jackson. Clay's solution, the compromise tariff of 1833, offered something for everyone. Tariff reductions for the South, a congressionally sanctioned force bill for nationalists, and crucially, the distribution of public land revenues to appease the West. It was just enough of an olive branch to de-escalate the crisis. But Jackson saw deeper than the day's headlines. 2 months later, he warned that the tariff was only the pretext, and disunion and Southern Confederacy the real object. The next pretext will be the slavery question. He was right. Despite steering the Union through the Nullification Crisis, Jackson remained deeply unpopular in large swaths of the country. In May 1833, that hostility turned violent. A former Navy officer lunged at the president and struck him, bloodying the president's face. Meacham notes, it was the first such physical assault on an American president, and the country reacted nervously, sensing that something deeper and more dangerous was simmering beneath the surface. With nullification temporarily resolved, Jackson turned his sights back to Nicholas Biddle. The bank's attempts to influence the 1832 election had failed, but the institution itself was still very much alive, and Jackson believed it was preparing for a counterstrike. He and his kitchen cabinet were convinced the bank could buy up enough votes in Congress to secure a veto-proof recharter. They pointed to cases like that of North Carolina Congressman Samuel Price Carson, an avowed Jacksonian who suddenly flipped his position after receiving a suspiciously large $20,000 loan on the very day he was scheduled to deliver an anti-bank speech. Jackson believed he had only one real option: remove the government's deposits. A bank's power and its profits depend on using deposits to issue loans. Without federal money in its vaults, Biddle wouldn't have the resources to court congressmen or bankroll political influence. The problem? No one agreed with him. James Polk, rapidly becoming Jackson's protege, compiled a detailed report citing at least 21 instances of corruption inside the bank. The House dismissed it with ease, rejecting Polk's findings 109 to 46. Jackson's own vice president opposed withdrawal, as did nearly every advisor he consulted. A key ally from New York warned him that half the merchants in the country would fail if he yanked federal deposits. But the president had made up his mind. When his Treasury Secretary refused to execute the order, Jackson fired him on the spot, and moved Attorney General Roger Taney into the role. Taney didn't hesitate. Biddle, meanwhile, remained irrationally confident. He bragged to supporters, "I wish to wait a little while until the smoke blows off before doing anything very decisive. For when once we begin, we shall have many things to do, which will crush the kitchen cabinet at once." Biddle expected state banks to refuse the federal deposits. Instead, they lined up eagerly, because bankers, like most of us, love making money. Unable to make any money for himself, Biddle reached for his most extreme weapon, calling in loans and restricting credit to manufacture a public backlash against the president. As Meacham explains, it was a bold maneuver, and one that played into Jackson's caricature of the bank as an aristocratic institution more interested in self-perpetuation than in the good of the country. Biddle's plan worked at first. By December, New York's economy was teetering. James Hamilton observed that business there was really in very great distress, nay, even to the point of general bankruptcy. Jackson began receiving 2 assassination letters a day from constituents whose livelihoods had collapsed under Biddle's credit squeeze. His advisors begged him to step back, but Jackson refused. "I would rather undergo the torture of 10 Spanish Inquisitions," he said, "than relent." Federal deposits were pulled from the Bank of the United States and funneled into a patchwork of state-chartered institutions that critics quickly labeled pet banks. The selection process was openly political. Many pet banks were located in swing states like Pennsylvania, Kentucky, and New York, and their appointment reflected loyalty as much as financial prudence. Once flooded with federal money, the pet banks began lending at a blistering pace. With minimal oversight and no centralized control, credit exploded. Land speculation, especially in the West, went wild. Prices soared. Economic bubbles inflated overnight. Without the bank's discipline, the national currency splintered into inconsistent, unreliable notes issued by hundreds of different institutions. Soon, Jackson's allies began to worry. What started as a populist crusade to dismantle an unaccountable financial elite had turned into a runaway economic experiment, one with no brakes. But Jackson wouldn't bend. For him, this was never just about banking. It was about the soul of American democracy. Would the nation be ruled by entrenched institutions or by the will of the people as embodied by their president? The consequences were already beginning to take shape. Without a central bank to steady the ship, the economy became whiplash vulnerable to swings in the credit market. Inflation crept upward. Land prices ballooned, and the seeds of a coming catastrophe were quietly taking root. Seeds that would erupt into the Panic of 1837, long after Jackson had left the White House. Jackson had won the battle against the bank, but the war over what kind of government the United States would become was just beginning. The Democratic Party emerged from the crisis firmly under Jackson's control. His common man rhetoric had struck a deep national chord, and his personal crusade against entrenched institutions gave the party a clear, unmistakable identity: pro-executive, anti-elite, and deeply suspicious of centralized authority, so long as that authority didn't challenge the will of a popularly elected president. Jackson's followers embraced this philosophy wholeheartedly, with Martin Van Buren positioning himself as the natural heir to Jacksonian democracy. But the president's aggressive tactics also sparked a counter-reaction. His sweeping vetoes, his defiance of the courts, the spoils system, and now the unilateral dismantling of the Bank of the United States. Each episode fed a growing conviction that the president had overstepped the constitutional boundaries of his office. Opposition leaders began to coalesce under the banner of the Whigs. They were a coalition of political misfits and strange bedfellows, former National Republicans, anti-Masons, disaffected Democrats, fiscal conservatives, united less by shared ideology than by shared alarm. To them, Jackson wasn't a champion of the people. He was an American Caesar. The Whigs called for a stronger Congress, a restored national bank, and federal support for internal improvements, roads, canals, and infrastructure that would knit the nation together. Where Jackson saw danger in elite-driven development, the Whigs saw order, opportunity, and national growth. Henry Clay and Daniel Webster became the party's intellectual backbone, championing the American system, an ambitious vision of modernization and managed economic expansion. Still, unity proved elusive. Unlike the Democrats, who had a clear leader in Jackson and a populist message that resonated everywhere from frontier taverns to urban workshops, the Whigs were fractured. Their coalition was broad but shallow. They had strength in old Federalist strongholds, in commercial cities, and in pockets of the South that distrusted Jackson's hard-edged leadership. But turning those groups into a coherent national party was like herding ideological cats. The fallout from the bank war then wasn't merely financial. It fundamentally reshaped American politics. It hardened partisan lines, redefined executive authority, and gave rise to the second party system, a political structure that would dominate the next generation of American life. In many ways, this was Jackson's greatest legacy, not only in what he built, but in what he forced his opponents to build in response. In the interim, however, the Whigs were too disorganized to mount a real challenge to Jackson's increasingly unitary executive. Henry Clay did manage one symbolic victory, a Senate vote to censure the president for his actions against the bank. The measure carried no legal weight, but it enraged Jackson. He spent the final months of his presidency in a single-minded campaign to have the note erased from the congressional record. And then came a reminder that domestic political theatrics can have global consequences. In the wake of the censure, France announced that because the president had acted unconstitutionally in seizing federal deposits, it no longer owed repayment on its long-standing debt to the United States. The diplomatic insults escalated into genuine war planning on both sides of the Atlantic. Ironically, it was the British, eager not to disrupt the lucrative trade with the American Northeast, who stepped in to cool tempers. In the end, France decided that a single line buried in one of Jackson's messages to Congress amounted to an acceptable apology, and the United States received the $25 million it was owed. It seemed petty and beneath the office, but Jackson relished the moment. Quoting George Washington on his way out of town, he reminded the country that there is a rank due to the United States among nations which will be withheld, if not absolutely lost, by the reputation of weakness. If we desire to avoid insult, we must be able to repel it. If we desire to secure peace, it must be known that we are at all times ready for war. He wasn't speaking only in metaphors. In 1835, the presidency itself nearly became a battlefield. At a congressional funeral, Richard Lawrence, an unemployed house painter, stepped from the crowd and fired 2 pistols at the president from 10 feet away. Witnesses heard the crack of the caps, but astonishingly, both guns misfired. Statistically, the odds of that happening were about 125,000 to 1. Recognizing the danger, the frail 67-year-old president, carrying a lifetime of dueling wounds and battlefield injuries, charged his attacker. He swung his cane, made of hardened hickory, and beat Lawrence to the ground until bystanders pulled the aging president off of him. Meacham writes that his life may have been saved in a way by George Washington and by the weather. Beneath the rotunda lay an unused tomb intended for Washington's remains. The open pit kept the hall damp, and combined with the misty weather that day, may have moistened the powder enough to prevent both pistols from firing. The courts quickly declared Lawrence insane, a conclusion supported by his claim that he was the rightful king of England and that Andrew Jackson was somehow preventing him from taking the throne. But the political effect was seismic. Jackson's improbable survival and the image of the president personally thrashing his would-be assassin sent his popularity soaring. Some even called his escape miraculous, a sign that Providence still guarded the hero of New Orleans. It also gave Jackson, just 1 year away from the end of his term, the perfect pretext to stay in office, if he wanted it. He could have argued credibly that the nation needed its warrior president in a moment of danger. He could have become the king that his opponents accused him of being. But Jackson didn't see divine intervention. Instead, he embraced a conspiracy theory that Lawrence had been sent by an opposition senator. And despite the opportunity, he chose not to break Washington's two-term precedent. Still, he left office with a long list of unfinished business. Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun remained powerful in the Senate. The Electoral College and state legislature control of Senate appointments still diluted the popular will. Nicholas Biddle sat atop a national bank that no longer had a national purpose, and despite federal orders, the Cherokee continued to resist leaving their ancestral homelands. Jackson had won many battles, but the America he envisioned was still very much a work in progress. Andrew Jackson did something many feared he wouldn't. He left office peacefully, honoring the precedent George Washington had set. In that single act, he proved his fiercest critics wrong. He hadn't clung to power. He had never crowned himself king. Instead, he stepped aside, still convinced of his own righteousness, still certain he had saved the republic, but willing to let the people choose their next leader. When he arrived in Washington, he saw enemies everywhere. He believed the American people needed a fighter in the White House, someone who would guard them as fiercely as he governed. And he embraced that role completely. Jackson reshaped the presidency, and with it, American democracy. He expanded the executive branch, not just in size, but in personality. He was unafraid to defy the courts, to twist constitutional silence into presidential authority, or to wield the office like a weapon instead of a ceremonial pen. In doing so, he set precedents, some bold, some reckless, but ones that would echo long after he was gone. Future presidents have found in Jackson exactly what they needed to find. Donald Trump praised him as a populist warrior unafraid to defy institutions. Abraham Lincoln, facing his own standoff with South Carolina, looked to Jackson's stand against nullification for moral and legal resolve. When compromise failed, Lincoln followed Jackson's example, not in rhetoric, but in force to hold the Union together. Jackson left office having inflicted deep wounds on the Republic, on native nations, on financial stability, and on the delicate balance of powers among the branches of government. But he also left behind something else, a modern presidency, more personal, more powerful, more defined by the will and the fury of the electorate. Love him or loathe him, Andrew Jackson revealed a permanent truth about American democracy. Sometimes the person who holds the office reshapes it far more than the office ever reshapes the person. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to interact with the show, you can email us at resourcesbylowery@gmail.com or find us on Bluesky beneath the handle EmpiresPod. If you would like to financially support the show, please look in the description for more information. As always, thank you for listening, rating the show, and spreading the word.